New at 10 o'clock, a Monday means roundabouts at the Quincy City Council meeting, and a decision made tonight means that a discussion will not end.
WGEM's Zeke Shapiro is now joining us to explain what that decision was. Zeke?
What is there left to say about the proposed roundabout project other than what happens next? Many of the hour-plus long public comments were against the roundabout project, which was reintroduced for discussion last week to Monday. Instead of voting on the intersection's future, which was previously accepted, a rare motion for a rescinding of the entire resolution was put forward. The vote ended 7-7, meaning that the packed house inside the chambers looked to Mayor Mike Trope, who voted yes, much to the support of residents who were against the resolution.
Quit spending where it's not needed until it is. John Wood's been fully opened out there since 2004. The county's had 20 years to fix their problem. They don't need us to do it. Thank you.
There was heated debate among all of the aldermen, including Alderman Mike Farha, who loudly voiced his displeasure with the way that the council had handled the situation. Next week, the council will once again look at the 4 different strategies to deal with the project and decide on what to go forward with. Daniel?
All right, thank you, Zeke. We'll, of course, be there, and we'll bring that to you next week. The other important discussion at the meeting tonight was about increasing salaries among the mayor and the aldermen. It was passed narrowly.